The desert stretched endlessly under the burning sun, a land of dust, rock, and silence. The sky above was wide and merciless, holding no clouds to soften its glare. The earth cracked beneath every step, and the hot wind carried the taste of sand and sorrow. On this lonely plain, a figure moved slowly, almost drifting like a shadow, an Apache woman named Awoke. Her steps wavered, her breath shallow, and every part of her body ached from wounds and exhaustion. She pressed her hand against her side, where dried blood stained her torn dress, but she could no longer feel the sharp sting of pain. It was as if her body had grown too tired to warn her. Awoke had once lived among her people in the valley near the mountains, where water flowed through the canyons and children's laughter carried in the wind. But that was before the raiders came. She remembered the sudden chaos, the flames that swallowed their lodges, the shouts of fear and the clash of rifles. She remembered clutching the hand of her younger brother as they tried to escape. Yet in the confusion they had been torn apart. She did not know if he lived or if the others had found safety. All she knew was that she had run, and now she was alone. The sun climbed higher as the hours passed. Her legs shook like dry branches in the wind. Her lips cracked from thirst, and every swallow felt like fire. The desert gave nothing. No shade, no water, no sign of life except the faint tracks of coyotes and vultures circling far above. Awoke's vision blurred, and the land ahead seemed to sway like a dream. Sometimes she thought she saw a river in the distance, only to stumble forward and find nothing but more sand. Yet even in her weakness, her spirit held the songs of her people. She remembered her grandmother's voice telling stories by the fire. "The ancestors watch," she had said. "They walk with you when you are strong, and they carry you when you cannot go on." Awoke whispered those words now, though her voice was barely more than air. She hoped the ancestors could hear her, for she felt her own strength slipping away. She fell to her knees. Dust rose in a faint cloud around her, clinging to her skin and her tangled black hair. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled and gave out. Lying on the ground, she felt the warmth of the earth press against her cheek. A warmth that spoke not of life, but of final rest. Her breath slowed and her eyes closed halfway. She thought of her mother's smile, of her father's proud voice, of her brother laughing as he raced the other boys by the river. The memories were like soft hands pulling her toward sleep. For a long moment, Awoke did not move. The desert was quiet except for the whisper of the wind through dry grass. She thought she heard the faint beat of a drum in the distance, steady and low, but perhaps it was only her heart giving its last call. She felt no fear, only a tired peace. She had run as far as she could. If this was the place where her spirit left her body, then so be it. She closed her eyes fully now, offering herself to the ancestors. Time passed. Minutes, perhaps hours. The sun shifted, shadows lengthened. Somewhere far away, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. A horse trotted slowly along the edge of a dry creek bed, carrying a rider dressed in dust-stained clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. His name was Jack Carver, a cowboy who had lived most of his life under the same wide sky. He was a man of few words, shaped by long days of labor and the silence of the open range. He had been returning from a cattle drive, his saddlebags heavy with supplies, when he noticed something strange ahead on the ground. At first, he thought it was a dead animal, perhaps a coyote struck by heat. But as his horse drew closer, he saw the figure more clearly. A woman lying in the dust, her chest rising faintly with breath. Jack reined in his horse and narrowed his eyes. He saw her dark braids, the patterns on her torn dress, and he knew at once that she was Apache. He sat still for a long moment, his hand resting on the reins. The frontier was filled with tension between settlers and the native tribes. He had seen men hanged for less than helping an Apache. His neighbors spoke of them with fear and anger. Bringing one into his home would draw suspicion, perhaps even hatred. But as he looked at her still body, the choice no longer felt like one of politics or tribes. It was life or death, and she had only a thin thread of life left. Jack swung down from his horse and knelt beside her. Her skin was hot to the touch, her lips cracked, and her body limp with exhaustion. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and tilted it carefully to her mouth. At first she did not stir, but when a drop of water touched her lips, she swallowed weakly. He gave her more slowly until her eyes fluttered open. For an instant, Awoke thought she was dreaming. The face above her was strange, sunburned, marked with lines of wind and labor, framed by a dusty hat. She saw blue eyes, steady but cautious. She tried to speak, but only a faint sound came. Her body was too heavy, too weak. She wanted to rise, to defend herself, but she could not even lift her hand. Jack studied her for a moment, then made his decision. He slid his arms beneath her frail body and lifted her gently, feeling how light she was. He carried her to his horse and placed her carefully across the saddle before climbing up himself. His horse snorted, uneasy with the new burden, but Jack steadied it with a firm hand. They rode toward his ranch, the horizon glowing red as the sun began to set. The cabin stood alone near a cluster of cottonwood trees, its wooden walls weathered but strong. Smoke from the chimney drifted into the evening air. Inside, it was simple but safe. A bed, a table, a stove, and shelves lined with tools and supplies. Jack carried Awoke inside and laid her on the bed, covering her with a clean blanket. He lit a lamp, its glow chasing away the shadows, and set about cleaning her wounds with water and cloth. She stirred once, her eyes flickering open, but soon drifted back into deep sleep. As the night fell, Jack sat in the chair by the bed, watching her breathe. He knew he had invited trouble into his home, but there was no turning back. For reasons he could not yet name, he felt it was the right thing to do. Out in the desert, the coyotes howled beneath the moon. But inside the cabin, an Apache woman who had closed her eyes to die now rested still alive in a cowboy's bed. The morning sun slipped through the cracks of the wooden shutters, painting long lines of gold across the cabin floor. Awoke stirred, the faint warmth on her face pulling her back from the heavy sleep that had claimed her. She blinked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light inside the cabin. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the desert, the burning heat, the dust, the taste of death on her lips. Yet here she was, lying on a soft bed, wrapped in a clean blanket, the scent of smoke and coffee drifting through the air. Her eyes darted across the small room. Rough wooden beams held the roof overhead. Shelves lined with tin cups and jars stood against one wall, and near the door hung a rifle on a peg. A chair sat pulled close to the bed, and in that chair, leaning forward with his arms resting on his knees, was a man she did not know. His hat was set on the table beside him, his hair unkempt from sleep and his boots dusted with the earth of long travel. He had dozed lightly, his chin nearly touching his chest, until the slight sound of her stirring pulled him awake. Jack Carver raised his head, his blue eyes meeting hers. For a heartbeat, they both remained silent, neither moving, as though afraid the moment would break. Then Jack spoke in a low, steady voice. "You're awake." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Awoke tensed, unsure whether she had been saved or captured. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her side and she fell back against the pillow with a soft gasp. Jack quickly lifted a hand, not to restrain her, but to calm her. "Don't push yourself. You're weak still." His voice was calm, not harsh, yet Awoke's heart beat fast. She had grown up hearing stories of cowboys and settlers, some who were fair, but many who saw her people as enemies. She did not know which kind this man was. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, and she said nothing. Jack studied her face, reading the guarded expression in her dark eyes. He understood her silence. Trust was not given easily, and he did not expect it. He rose slowly from the chair and walked to the stove, where a pot of coffee sat warming. He poured himself a cup, then filled another with water and placed it on the table near her bed. "You need water more than words," he said quietly. Awoke hesitated, then reached for the cup with a trembling hand. She sipped slowly, the cool water easing the dryness in her throat. Though she wished to keep her pride, she could not hide the relief that spread through her body as the thirst lifted. She set the cup down gently, her eyes never leaving the man. Jack did not press her with questions. Instead, he busied himself around the cabin, as though her presence were nothing unusual. He checked the fire, adjusted the bandages on her side when she allowed it, and left a piece of bread on the table for her to take if she wished. His silence was not cold but patient, the kind of quiet that came from a man used to living alone on the frontier. As the hours passed, Awoke studied him. His movements were steady and without rush. He did not look at her with hatred, nor did he treat her as a burden. When she dared to whisper why. In halting English, Jack paused from sharpening his knife and glanced at her. "You were dying out there," he answered simply. "I couldn't ride on and leave you to the coyotes." The honesty in his tone surprised her. There was no boast in his words, no demand for gratitude, only a plain truth. Ayoka looked away, her thoughts tangled. She had expected cruelty or indifference, but this man offered neither. That night, the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Jack sat near the hearth, repairing a leather strap, while Ayoka lay awake in the bed. She listened to the sounds, the steady scrape of his knife, the soft howl of wind outside, the distant call of a night bird. In her heart, fear remained, but something else stirred as well, curiosity. Why would a cowboy risk himself to help her, knowing the trouble it could bring? Days passed in much the same way. Jack tended his ranch during the daylight hours, feeding the horses, checking the fences, and hauling water from the creek. He returned often to the cabin, making sure Ayoka had food and water, never leaving her for long. She began to regain strength, sitting up in bed, then standing with the support of the table. Her wounds healed slowly under his careful attention. Though words between them were few, small gestures built a fragile bridge. When Jack left bread on the table, Ayoka murmured a soft thank you, her accent thick but clear. When he poured water into her cup, she met his eyes briefly, no longer filled with the same sharp distrust. At night, when the firelight danced against the wooden walls, she sometimes hummed a quiet tune, an Apache song her mother had taught her. Jack listened without comment, but she noticed his hands slowed in their work, as if the melody carried him somewhere far away. Outside the cabin, however, the world was not as quiet. Jack knew word would spread if anyone discovered who he sheltered. Already, when he had ridden into town days before, neighbors had muttered about Apache raids and stolen cattle. Fear made men quick to judge, and suspicion made them cruel. If they learned he had brought an Apache woman into his home, they would not see kindness, they would see betrayal. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in red, Jack leaned against the doorway, gazing out at the empty land. Ayoka sat at the table, her posture straight though her body still fragile. She noticed the weight in his eyes and asked softly, "Danger?" Jack turned toward her, surprised at her choice to speak. After a pause, he nodded. "Some folks wouldn't take kindly to this. To you being here. To me keeping you here." Ayoka lowered her gaze, her hands folding tightly in her lap. She had brought trouble before when the raiders came. Now again her presence placed another in harm's way. She whispered in her own tongue a prayer for strength, then lifted her head. "I will go," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. Jack shook his head. "You're not ready. If you go now, the desert will finish what it started." He paused, then added, "And I wouldn't feel right letting that happen." The quiet words struck her deeply. He owed her nothing, yet he continued to choose her life over his own safety. For the first time since the raid, Ayoka felt the faint stir of hope. Perhaps the world still held places where kindness lived, even in the heart of a cowboy's cabin. That night, as she lay under the blanket, she closed her eyes not with the expectation of death, but with the strange comfort of knowing she was not alone. The fire's glow painted soft shadows across the walls, and the sound of the cowboy's steady breathing filled the silence. Though the future was uncertain, a fragile bond had been born, one built not by words but by the quiet courage of two souls from different worlds who found themselves bound together by fate. The days passed slowly, each one carrying a rhythm shaped by work, silence, and small moments of understanding. Ayoka grew stronger with every sunrise. The wounds that once bound her to the bed began to heal, and soon she was able to stand, then walk carefully across the wooden floor. Her steps were cautious, like a deer testing the ground after a storm, but her spirit, though scarred, was still alive. Jack Carver watched her progress with quiet attention. He never pressed her with questions, never demanded to know who she was or what had driven her to the desert. Instead, he gave her space, allowing trust to grow at its own pace. He went about his ranch chores as he always had, feeding the horses, chopping wood, checking the fences that marked his land. But now, he carried the silent knowledge that he was no longer alone. At first, Ayoka did not know how to live in this new place. Everything felt strange. The walls of rough-hewn logs, the tools hanging neatly on pegs, the sound of a clock ticking on the shelf. Her people had lived with the earth, guided by the cycles of nature, not by clocks or fences. Yet she could not deny that Jack's cabin was a shelter, and that within its walls she had been given back her life. Their exchanges were brief, often no more than a few words. Jack would place bread or stew before her, and she would whisper, "Thank you." He would nod in return, his expression unreadable but never unkind. At night she sometimes hummed soft songs of her people, words of memory and longing that floated like smoke into the air. Jack never interrupted her. He simply sat by the fire, his head bent over some piece of leather or rope. But his hands slowed when the melody reached his ears. One evening, as the firelight flickered against the walls, Awoke noticed Jack polishing a small wooden carving. It was a horse, simple but carefully shaped. She watched him for a while before asking softly, "You carve?" Jack glanced at her, surprised she had spoken more than a word. He nodded. "Sometimes. Helps pass the quiet." She leaned forward slightly, her curiosity breaking through her caution. "Good," she said in her halting English. "Like real horse." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Jack's mouth. "You know horses well?" Awoke nodded. "My people. Ride strong, swift like river." For the first time, their words became more than necessity. It was the beginning of a bridge, shaky but real. As the days turned into weeks, Awoke began to help in small ways. Though still weak, she insisted on sweeping the floor, fetching water from the bucket and mending small tears in Jack's shirts with needle and thread she found in the cabin. Jack did not stop her. He respected her pride and understood that she needed to feel useful, not helpless. One afternoon, Jack returned from checking the cattle to find Awoke outside, leaning against the wooden railing of the corral. She stood tall, her hair loose in the wind, her eyes fixed on the horizon. For a moment, she looked like a figure carved from the land itself, proud, enduring, unbroken. When she turned and saw him, there was no fear in her gaze, only quiet strength. "You walk far?" Jack asked. She shook her head. "Not far, just sky." She pointed to the wide, endless horizon. "Big, like home." Jack followed her gaze. The prairie stretched out in every direction, golden grass rippling under the wind, mountains faint in the distance. "Yes," he said. "It's big. Easy to get lost, harder to find your way back." Awoke looked at him then, her eyes holding questions she did not voice. Did he understand what it meant to lose everything? Did he know the weight of carrying memories that cut deeper than wounds? Though she did not ask, Jack seemed to sense her thoughts. "I lost people too," he said quietly. "Long time ago. That's why I keep to myself now." The words were few, but they carried a truth that sank into Ayoka's heart. She realized then that loneliness was something they both shared, though their worlds were different. The fragile peace between them grew stronger, but outside the cabin, trouble was stirring. Jack heard it when he went into town for supplies. Men gathered near the saloon, muttering about raids, about cattle gone missing, about Apache camps rumored to be nearby. Their voices were sharp with fear and anger. Jack kept his head down, but he caught the glances, eyes narrowing as if they suspected he was hiding something. He knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion reached his ranch. Neighbors came by less often now, and when they did, their questions carried weight. "You keeping busy out there, Jack? Haven't seen much of you lately." The words were casual, but the eyes behind them were searching. Back at the cabin, Jack said nothing of this to Awoke. He did not want to burden her with fear, not when she was only just beginning to heal. But Awoke sensed the tension in him anyway. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened when he returned from town, in the way he stood at the doorway longer than before, scanning the horizon as if expecting riders to appear. One evening, she spoke what was on her heart. "You, danger, because of me?" Jack turned from the fire, meeting her steady gaze. He did not deny it. "Maybe, but leaving you out there wasn't right." Awoke lowered her head. "I bring trouble." "Always trouble?" Jack crossed the room slowly, crouching so he was eye level with her. His voice was firm but gentle. "You didn't bring trouble. Trouble finds us all sooner or later. What matters is what we do when it comes." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she felt the heavy shield of mistrust inside her crack just a little. As spring winds swept across the plains, their bond deepened in quiet ways. Jack taught her how to use the stove without burning the bread. She showed him how to braid strips of leather into strong cords. He laughed once, short and rough, when she scolded him for clumsy stitching. She smiled in return, a smile that felt foreign on her face after so many days of sorrow, yet warm like the sun after rain. Still, shadows lingered. Each knock on the cabin door made Awoke tense, fearing it would be men demanding her removal. Each ride Jack took into town stretched her nerves thin, wondering if he would return at all. The world beyond their fragile circle did not understand what had grown between them. Two souls from opposite sides of the frontier, finding trust where none should exist. One night, as they sat by the fire, Awoke lifted her voice in a fuller song than before. The melody rose and fell like the breath of the earth, carrying the strength of her ancestors. Jack listened, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and when the song ended, he said softly, "It's beautiful." She tilted her head. "Song of healing," she explained. "Old song. My mother sing when hurt. Make heart strong." Jack nodded. "Seems to work. You're stronger every day." Her gaze lingered on him, steady and unafraid. "Not just song," she said. "You help too." The silence that followed was filled not with distance but with unspoken understanding. Outside, the wind carried whispers of change. The prairie stretched wide, holding both promise and danger. Within the cabin, however, two hearts, once strangers, once enemies by birth, had begun to find a place of trust. The world around them might not allow it, but in that moment, neither Jack nor Awoke cared. For the first time since she had closed her eyes to die in the desert, Awoke felt truly alive. The peace that had grown between Jack and Awoke was fragile, like a thin sheet of ice across a river, strong enough to carry them for a time, yet always at risk of breaking beneath the weight of the world outside. For weeks, their days followed a rhythm of quiet work and cautious hope. Jack tended his cattle and checked the fences, while Awoke helped with small tasks around the cabin. She had healed enough to move with strength, her steps steady now, her eyes sharper, alive again. But beneath this fragile peace, both knew a storm was gathering. The first signs came in whispers. Jack heard them in town when he went for supplies. Men at the saloon spoke in harsh voices about missing cattle, about shadows seen near ranches at night, about Apache camps they believed were too close. They spoke with anger, with fear, and fear made men dangerous. One name surfaced more than once: Elias Moore, a rancher with a reputation for stirring trouble. Elias had long been suspicious of anyone who kept to themselves, and Jack's quiet ways made him an easy target for gossip. Jack returned from town with supplies loaded on his horse, his jaw tight, his mind heavy. He said little to Awoke, not wanting to burden her, but she saw the change in him. His eyes scanned the horizon more often, his hand lingered near the rifle above the door, and his nights grew restless. One evening, as the sun bled red across the prairie, Awoke spoke the truth aloud. "They come," she said quietly. Jack turned, surprised by her certainty. "What makes you think so?" She lifted her chin, her gaze steady. "Eyes, you look for riders every day. Heart knows before mouth says." Jack let out a slow breath. "You're right. I reckon it's only a matter of time." Her expression softened, though fear flickered in her eyes. "Because of me." Jack shook his head firmly. "No, because men like Elias need someone to blame. You're not the cause. You're just their excuse." The words eased her guilt, but they did not erase the danger. The danger arrived 2 nights later. It was late, the cabin quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Awoke was mending a tear in one of Jack's shirts while he sat sharpening a knife. Then, faint at first but growing clearer, came the sound of horses. Hooves thudded against the earth, steady and deliberate. Jack set the knife down slowly, his muscles tightening. He crossed to the door and looked out through the narrow crack. Lanterns flickered in the darkness. 4 riders approached, their figures outlined by the pale light of the moon. At their head rode Elias Moore, broad-shouldered, his voice carrying even before he reached the cabin. "Carver," Elias shouted. "Come out and talk." Jack's jaw clenched. He glanced back at Awoke, who had risen to her feet, her hands trembling but her eyes fierce. He shook his head slightly, signaling her to stay hidden. Then he stepped outside, the door creaking behind him. The riders drew up in front of the cabin, their horses snorting, their faces shadowed but hard. Elias leaned forward in his saddle, a smirk twisting his lips. "Word's been spreading, Carver," he said. "Folks say you've been keeping company out here. Say you've got yourself an Apache woman under your roof." Jack's voice was calm but firm. "You shouldn't believe everything you hear." Elias narrowed his eyes. "I don't need to believe. I can see the signs. Tracks by the creek. Smoke at odd hours. You've been hiding her and we all know it." He leaned closer, his tone sharpening. "You hand her over, Carver, or you'll answer for it." Jack's hand tightened at his side. "She's no threat to anyone. She's just trying to live." The men behind Elias muttered darkly, shifting in their saddles. One spat into the dirt. Her kind killed my cousin, he growled. Another added, they'll bring more. Raiders, thieves, the whole lot. Elias raised his voice, turning to the others. You hear that? He admits it. He's got her inside, protecting her. What kind of man betrays his own people like that? Jack's temper flared, but he kept his voice even. The kind who doesn't let a woman die in the dirt. The standoff thickened, tension crackling in the air like a storm about to break. Awoke, peering through the narrow window, felt her heart hammering. She knew she had brought this danger to him. Part of her wanted to slip out the back, to run into the darkness and draw the riders away. But another part, the stronger part, refused to leave the man who had saved her. Before either side could act, another sound cut through the night. From the distance came the faint call of voices, followed by the silhouettes of riders approaching fast. Jack turned his head sharply, recognizing the shapes even before they drew close. Apache scouts, their horses swift and sure, had found the cabin. The new arrivals pulled up at the edge of the lantern light. Their leader, a young warrior with feathers tied in his hair, raised his hand. His eyes went to Awoke, who now stepped out from the cabin despite Jack's protest. The warrior's face softened with recognition. She was one of their own, lost and now found. The air grew heavy as the two groups faced each other, cowboys on one side, Apaches on the other, mistrust burning between them. Jack and Awoke stood in the middle, caught in a line that could explode at any moment. Elias's voice rose, sharp with anger. See, I told you. They're here for her. You brought them down on us, Carver. The Apache warrior's hand hovered near his weapon, though he did not draw it. We come for our sister, he said in broken English. Not for war. Jack stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. Nobody needs to die tonight, he said firmly. She was left for dead. I found her. That's all. You want her safe? Then take her. But don't turn this land into a battlefield. For a long, tense moment, silence ruled. Horses shifted uneasily, and the fire from the cabin cast long, trembling shadows across the dirt. Awoke looked from one side to the other. Her heart ached with the weight of the choice before her. She could return to her people where blood and memory tied her. But in Jack's cabin she had found something she had never expected. Kindness from a stranger, trust across a divide. Finally, the Apache warrior lowered his hand. We take her, he said. But we leave in peace. Elias bristled. This ain't over, Carver. You'll regret siding with them. He pulled his horse around, the other ranchers following with angry mutters. Their lanterns disappeared into the dark, leaving only the fading thud of hooves. The Apaches remained a moment longer. Awoke stepped forward, her voice steady, though her eyes shone with unspoken pain. I go, she told Jack. Jack's chest tightened, but he nodded slowly. If that's what you want. Her gaze lingered on him, long and searching. Not want, she said softly. Need. With that, she turned and mounted one of the Apache horses. The warriors wheeled away into the night, their forms swallowed by the darkness. Jack stood alone in the yard, the quiet pressing heavy against him. The danger had passed for now, but the bond he and Awoke had built hung in the air like a fire that refused to die. He knew this was not the end. The storm had not yet spent its fury, it had only begun. The prairie stretched endlessly under the rising sun, a golden sea of grass swaying in the morning breeze. For days, Jack Carver worked his ranch as if nothing had changed. He fed the cattle, repaired the fences, and rode the land with the same steady rhythm he had always known. But inside him, everything had changed. The cabin felt emptier now, the silence heavier. The chair by the fire where Awoke once sat lay untouched. The soft hum of her songs no longer drifted through the night air. Jack had told himself he had done the right thing. Letting her go with her people was safer for her, safer for him. Yet each evening as the sun bled across the horizon, he found his thoughts turning to her face, to the way her eyes had softened when she finally trusted him, to the quiet bond they had shared in the glow of the firelight. The world outside was restless. Elias Moore's anger had not cooled. Word spread through the town that Jack had sheltered an Apache woman. Some called him a fool, others whispered harsher names. Jack met their eyes with silence, but he knew he had been marked. Suspicion clung to him like dust on his boots. Meanwhile, Awoke traveled with her people. The Apache scouts who had found her led her back to a small camp, hidden in the shelter of the mountains. There she was greeted with relief and sorrow. Survivors of the raid gathered around her, voices low with grief for those who had not returned. Her younger brother had lived, though scarred by the memory of fire and loss. Together they mourned their parents, their friends, the home they could not rebuild. Among her people, Awoke was safe, but her heart was restless. At night, as the fire crackled under the stars, her thoughts strayed to the cabin, to the man who had lifted her from the dust when she had no strength left. She had gone with her people out of duty, but part of her spirit remained behind. She had not expected kindness from a cowboy, yet Jack Carver's quiet strength had given her back more than life. It had given her hope. The storm that had begun at the cabin had not ended. Elias Moore and his men grew bolder, riding the land with anger in their hearts. They blamed the Apaches for every missing calf, every broken fence, whether true or not. And in their anger, they looked to Jack as the man who had sided with the enemy. It was on a warm evening, with the sky painted in streaks of orange and purple, that the storm returned. Jack was mending a section of fence when he heard the thunder of hooves. He turned to see Elias and 3 other ranchers riding hard toward him, rifles slung across their shoulders. Jack stood firm, his hammer still in hand as they pulled up in a cloud of dust. Elias's face was twisted with fury. "Carver," he spat on, "we warned you. You chose them over us. Now you'll pay the price." Jack's voice was calm but unyielding. "I chose to save a life. That's all," Elias sneered. "Don't matter. You brought them down on us. You'll regret it." Before Jack could reply, a whistle cut through the air. From the ridge above, riders appeared. Apache warriors, their horses swift, their faces painted with determination. At their head rode the young scout who had found Awoke, and beside him, straight-backed and fierce, rode Awoke herself. The 2 groups faced each other across the open prairie, dust swirling between them. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the restless snort of horses. Awoke dismounted first, her eyes fixed on Jack. For a moment, the noise of the world fell away. She crossed the distance between them, her step steady, her gaze unflinching. When she stood before him, she spoke softly but firmly. "You helped me live. Now I help you." Jack's heart tightened. He had not expected to see her again, yet here she was, standing tall, her spirit stronger than ever. Elias shouted angrily, pointing at her. "There. She's the reason for all this trouble. Take her away or there'll be blood tonight." The Apache warrior beside Awoke lifted his hand. "We came not for war," he said, "but we will not stand by if you bring it." Jack stepped forward, his voice rising above the wind. "Enough. This land's seen too much blood already. You want to blame someone, Elias? Blame the raiders, not her. Blame the hate that makes men blind. But don't bring it here." The ranchers muttered among themselves. Their rifles shifted in their hands, but doubt flickered in their eyes. Elias, however, would not back down. His pride burned hotter than reason. "Then you stand with them, Carver," he growled. "And that makes you my enemy." Before he could raise his rifle, Awoke's voice rang out clear and strong. "No more death," she cried. Her words carried across the prairie, filled with the weight of her loss and the strength of her spirit. "I lost my family to fire and hate. I will not see more die because men cannot see beyond it." Her courage struck like lightning. Even Jack felt the power of her voice. For a long moment, the prairie held its breath. Then one of the ranchers lowered his rifle slowly, shaking his head. "Elias, this ain't worth it," he muttered. "We came for justice, not slaughter." Another followed, turning his horse away. Only Elias remained, his face red with fury. He glared at Jack, then at Awoke, before finally yanking his reins. "This ain't over," he hissed, and with a sharp kick he rode off into the distance, dust trailing behind him. The danger passed, but the silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Awoke stood beside Jack, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The Apache warriors nodded to her, then turned their horses toward the mountains, leaving her with the choice she had carried in her heart since the night she left. She looked at Jack. "I go with them. Or I stay." Jack met her gaze, steady and sure. "It's your choice. Always was." The wind tugged at her hair, carrying with it the scent of grass and earth. She thought of her people, of duty and memory. But she also thought of the cabin, of the quiet nights by the fire, of the man who had stood against his own kind to protect her. Slowly she nodded. "I stay." Relief and warmth spread through Jack's chest, though he did not show it with more than a faint smile. Together they turned toward the cabin, the prairie stretching wide before them. The world would not suddenly grow kinder, and danger would always ride close in the Wild West. But for the first time, neither of them faced it alone. The sun broke through the clouds, bathing the land in golden light. Ayoka lifted her face to the sky, her eyes shining. She had once closed them expecting death, but now, beside the cowboy who had given her life back, she opened them to a new dawn, and together, they walked forward into a future shaped not by fear, but by courage, trust, and the fragile, unyielding hope that even in the wildest lands peace could be found.